Hi everyone, I hope you're doing really well. Welcome to What the Horror, where this humble horror fan shares her thoughts on horror films past and present. In today's episode, we are looking at Halloween, released in 1978, and Halloween, released in 2007. That's right, today's episode is a twofer. Seeing as how we are now finally in October, and with the upcoming release of Halloween Kills, I thought what better time to revisit the original and check out the early 2000s remake. Just a heads up, as always, I will be talking about both films in depth and including spoilers, so if you haven't seen the films yet, I would recommend going and watching them first and then coming back to the episode. On Halloween night in 1963, 6-year-old Michael Myers kills his 17-year-old sister Judith. He's locked away for 15 years in Smith's Grove Sanatorium, but while being transferred for a court date, 21-year-old Michael steals a car and escapes. He returns to his quiet hometown of Haddonfield, where he looks for his next victims. The original Halloween was written, directed and scored by John Carpenter, and co-written and produced by Carpenter's then-girlfriend Deborah Hill. Deborah in particular wrote the dialogue between Laurie and her friends, wanting to give it that organic feel, for it to feel very natural, and she also gave us the idea of Ghost Bob. Halloween is one of the big three in slasher horror franchises alongside Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. It's really hard to express how important and influential Halloween has been on films in the horror industry. Halloween is actually directly responsible for the creation of the Friday the 13th franchise. When he saw Halloween's success at the box office, producer and director Sean Cunningham decided to ride the coattails of Halloween and create his own money-making slasher, which he did very successfully. Halloween wasn't the first slasher. We had Psycho and Peeping Tom released in 1960, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Black Christmas released in 1974. However, it was the first slasher to set out the formulas we know today, and to establish the tropes that would later be satirised in the film Scream. You have the virginal final girl and the final girl circuit where she discovers all the dead bodies. You have the sexually active characters being killed off. You have POV shots creating a level of tension and suspense. You have theme music for the villain, and you also have an unkillable villain. Alongside Friday the 13th's Jason Voorhees, Halloween's Michael Myers is arguably one of the most famous and recognisable villains in horror film history. In the original Halloween, there is no explanation for Michael Myers' actions except for the fact that he is pure evil. When creating Michael Myers, Carpenter was actually inspired by Celtic Halloween traditions such as Samhain. The idea being that on the 31st of October, the boundary between our world and the other world could be crossed, and evil souls could come out and wreak havoc on the living. And as the evil couldn't be killed, to pacify them, the living would leave out offerings of food and drink outside their homes. I think this is why at the end of the film, when Sam Loomis shoots Michael 6 times, Michael doesn't die. It's because Michael Myers is evil incarnate, and you can't kill evil on the 31st of October. The original Halloween follows the simple 3-act formula. In Act 1, I think Carpenter and Hill do a fantastic job of establishing the everyday Americana in Haddonfield, and it introduces us to the final girl Laurie Strode and her friends. And then Act 2 is essentially just one big tease. After we are introduced to the girls and grow to care for them, we then follow Michael as he stalks in and around the houses that Annie and Laurie are babysitting at. By the end of Act 2 and going into Act 3, Michael's activities have amped up. He kills the Wallace family dog, and then of course he kills Annie as well. And it's this part of the film that I really love, where the scenes flip-flop back and forth between scenes at the Wallace house and then scenes at the Doyle house, where you have the contrast between the normality in the activities that Laurie and the children are doing, such as watching a scary film, carving a pumpkin, and you have that contrasted with the real horrors that are unfolding over the road at the Wallace house. Generally, I'm quite bored by the third act of slasher films, not by all of them, but by most of them. But I'm not bored by Halloween's third act. I think it is masterfully done, and we have a really likeable and capable final girl in Laurie Strode. I love how resourceful she is. She doesn't just run around and scream. She's really observant of her surroundings, and she makes use of objects that are to hand to help protect her. And this idea and character trait has been dropped through the film since we were introduced to her. The idea that Laurie is more observant and tuned into what's going on than her friends. That's why earlier in the film it was Laurie who kept picking up on Michael. She kept seeing him around and she began to feel uneasy about it, all the while her friends just remained completely oblivious to what's going on and to Michael's presence. I know Laurie Strode is often considered one of, if not the best final girl. I think she tops a lot of people's top 10 lists, definitely. So after the original was released in 1978, we had 7 sequels spanning 21 years. And then in 2007, we were treated to a remake. After spending 17 years in Smith's Grove Mental Institution for killing his stepfather and older sister, Michael Myers escapes and sets out to find his younger sister Boo. He doesn't spare anyone who tries to interfere with his mission, and the only person that might be able to put a stop to Michael's rampage is Dr. Sam Loomis. The Halloween remake was written and directed by Rob Zombie, and it stars his wife Sherry Moon Zombie from the Firefly trilogy, and it also stars Tyler Mane from the X-Men and Troy. I have to say, one of my absolute favourite things about this film is the horror alumni cast. You have Danielle Harris from Halloween 4, you have Dee Wallace from Cujo, Bill Moseley from Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, and the voice of Chucky himself, Brad Dourif. When it came out that Rob Zombie was going to remake Halloween, John Carpenter told him to make the film his own, and he certainly does that. This remake is not subtle. In the first 5 minutes, it feels like an assault on the senses. The title card alone feels like an almost literal slap in the face, followed quickly by loud bass in music, and then the audience is treated to the breakfast table scene, which is an aggressive, violent family scene filled with profanities. But what Zombie successfully does within these first 5 minutes is show the audience that this is going to be a very different version of Halloween. So Rob Zombie's Halloween came out in the early 2000s, which saw an outpouring of horror film remakes. And not just remakes, but remakes amped up to 100. These films pushed the lines set out by the originals, and they went much darker and much more violent. These remakes also felt the need to explain the origin of the film's villains, delving further into their backstory. As I said earlier, Carpenter's Michael Myers is just pure evil, but in Rob Zombie's Halloween, Michael is a product of his childhood and his environment, and the level of anger and violence that he is exposed to. As origins go, I think it's a really good one. I think it's believable, and I liked the detail of them adding in that Michael started off by killing animals before he moves on to people. Not that I like people killing animals, but just that studies have shown that in the real world, serial killers often started out by killing animals in their youth. I think it really comes down to personal preference as to whether you, as an individual, feel you need that explanation. I personally don't. I actually find it a lot scarier when there isn't a reason for what the killers are doing. However, one aspect of the origin story that I did really like was that Rob Zombie wanted to explain why Michael wears a mask. And this is because he wants to hide from the world and from people, and wearing a mask allows him to do this. And while in Smith's Grove, Michael's reliance on masks increases the more he retreats inwards on himself. The scenes in Smith Grove Sanatorium are actually some of my favourites of the film. I really loved the washed out graininess to them. They're really bright and clinical, and it contrasts beautifully with the darkness of the second half of the film. And I also really like how they show you the gradual decline in Michael's mental health through the cuts showing the passage of time. And Zombie's Halloween, it doesn't follow the 3-act formula, or it doesn't seem to. It feels like it's 2 films within one. In the first 50 minutes, you have the origin of Michael and his backstory. And then the rest of the film is the actual remake. And it takes a full 50 minutes for us to actually meet the final girl, Laurie Strode. And talking of Laurie, I hate to be negative, but I'm just not a huge fan of this version of Laurie. I don't find her as endearing as the original, and I just didn't find myself rooting for her. However, I will say that I find her friendship with the girls really believable, and I really loved her interactions with her mum and dad. There are loads of nods to the original in this as well, which I appreciated. There's Ghost Bob and Linda saying totally all the time, and you have the iconic scene of Laurie looking out of her classroom window and seeing that Michael is spying on her. But there are also lots of differences because this is a Rob Zombie film and the body count is a lot higher and it is chock full of violence and language. There are two aspects of Zombies Halloween though that I preferred to the original. Now hold on, hear me out. One of them is very simple, and that's the fact that the original Halloween was filmed in spring, and the production company had to get really creative to create that Halloween feel by painting leaves and scattering them around scenes. But with Zombies Halloween, it was actually filmed in autumn or fall, and you really get a more authentic Halloween sense from the film, and I appreciated that. And the other one is that, in my opinion, the character of Sheriff Beckett is a lot stronger in this film, and he is played brilliantly by Brad Dourif. I loved the addition of Beckett being standoffish with Loomis because he feels that Loomis is a sellout. He feels he has benefited off the back of his book and off the back of the tragedies of Haddonfield. I can understand why this film is divisive, especially if you are a die-hard fan of the franchise. I personally didn't hate the remake, but I didn't love it either. I just simply enjoyed it. There were lots of creative choices that I could appreciate, but there were also aspects of it that I felt were unnecessary. I think it's worth mentioning that the version that I watched was the theatrical version, and I haven't seen the director's cut, and I know that it's actually the director's cut that is a lot more accessible. That one has a longer, a bloated runtime, and I know it also has the inclusion of a really unpleasant scene in the Smiths Grove Sanatorium. And I do wonder if that was the version I'd seen, if it would have affected my enjoyment of the film. But as it is, I saw the theatrical and I thought it was okay. So that's Halloween and Halloween. I was actually a little bit nervous about doing this episode, only because of how big and important Halloween is. And I wasn't sure what there was that I could talk about that hasn't been talked about already so many times before by people who are far more knowledgeable than I am. But in saying all that, I hope there was something in this episode that you found to enjoy. I know I enjoyed revisiting the classic of the original, and I also enjoyed checking out the remake. Thank you to all of you for stopping by and listening to this humble horror fan's thoughts. I appreciate each and every one of you. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye guys.